What avoidants hope for when you go no contact, you've finally had enough. You stop chasing, you've stopped reaching out, you go no contact. And part of you hopes this will wake them up, that it'll make them see your value. But here's the truth that's harder to hear. Avoidants don't always interpret silence the way you think they will. See, avoidants crave closeness but fear it at the same time. That's the paradox. So when you go no contact, something interesting happens. It gives them space, which they actually want. But it also triggers something deeper. They start to wonder, why haven't they reached out? Have they finally moved on? Wait, did they stop needing me? And here's what they hope, quietly, secretly. When you go silent, they hope you'll still be there. Eventually, that this is a pause, not a goodbye, that they've bought themselves space without losing your affection. They hope they can come back on their terms, when it's comfortable, when it costs them nothing, because avoidants often want connection without vulnerability. They want the emotional safety of your love without being responsible for maintaining it. But here's where you take your power back. No contact isn't a game. It's not a tactic to win someone over. It's a decision to stop being someone's emotional safety net, someone who's only loved when it's convenient. When you go no contact, and actually mean it, not as punishment, not to manipulate, but to protect your peace, that's when you reclaim your worth. And maybe they'll come back. But the real win is that by then, you'll have outgrown what you once settled for. When someone with an avoidant attached style is faced with no contact, their initial reaction is often one of relief rather than loss. This can be confusing and even painful for someone who hoped that silence would prompt a moment of clarity or regret. But avoidants are wired differently. Their default reaction to emotional intensity is to retreat, to regulate themselves by creating distance. So when that distance is handed to them, when the texts stop, the calls don't come, the emotional pressure dissolves. It feels, at least on the surface, like a breath of fresh air. They don't feel punished. They feel safer. It's not because they didn't care or because you didn't matter. It's because closeness triggers a fear in them. A fear of being overwhelmed, of losing autonomy, of not being enough, or worse, of being consumed by Elsie's emotional needs. So when contact ceases, there's a sense of momentary comfort. They can finally breathe again without feeling the silent obligation to respond, to explain, to perform emotionally. This isn't always a conscious thought. Most avoidants aren't sitting there thinking, I'm glad they're gone. It's more subtle. It's the absence of pressure. It's the space to go back to their routines, their solitude, their emotional safety zone. They may distract themselves, stay busy, or simply enjoy the quiet. And during this time, they often reinforce their narrative. See, this is why I don't get too close. It always gets intense. The person on the receiving end of that silence often misreads this phase. They assume that because the avoidant isn't reaching out, they don't care. They assume the no contact didn't work. But what's actually happening is more nuanced. The avoidant isn't necessarily celebrating the absence of the relationship. They're just not equipped to feel the loss immediately. They have to move through several layers before they even recognize something's missing. And often that realization only comes when they expect to find you still there and you're not. Avoidants often need space before they can even start feeling longing. Closeness short-circuits their ability to reflect. It's only when the dust has settled, when the quiet becomes noticeable instead of soothing, that their mind might start wondering, wait, where did they go? But in the beginning, when no contact is fresh, what they feel most is release, not rejection. That's why going no contact isn't a surefire way to make someone chase you, especially someone with avoidant tendencies. It's not an immediate emotional trigger for them, the way it might be for someone with an anxious attachment. The absence doesn't register as abandonment. It registers as relief. And that's important to understand so you don't mistake their silence for cruelty or their lack of reaction for indifference. It's just that their system interprets space as comfort. That's their default. It's only with time and emotional maturity that some avoidants begin to question whether that comfort is worth the cost of real connection. When someone with an avoidant attachment style is met with silence, when you go no contact, they often carry a quiet hoping that your silence isn't final, that it's just temporary, that even though you're not calling, texting, or checking in, you're still emotionally available to them, waiting in the background just as you always were. They hope you've pulled back, but not walked away, that you're still watching, still waiting. This belief allows them to maintain the illusion of control. They can enjoy the space without fully confronting the idea that they might have truly lost you. Avoidants tend to view emotional closeness as something that comes with strings attached, obligations, expectations, demands. When things get too emotionally charged, they withdraw. needing to re-establish a sense of safety through distance. But even in that distance, they often don't want to feel the consequences of their disconnection. They want the best of both worlds, space and security, independence and your affection. So when you go quiet, they often assume it's a phase, that eventually, once you've cooled down, you'll reach back out. In their minds, this isn't about you not. They haven't lost you. They've just bought time. What they quietly hope for is that you'll still be there when they're ready, that your love will remain accessible even though they aren't investing in it. They hope they haven't burned the bridge, just put it on pause. This is part of why avoidants can seem so indifferent in the short term. They don't see your silence as an ending, but as a cooling off period. And in many past dynamics, that's what's happened. You've pulled back before and come back. You've gone silent before and returned. So they've come to rely on the pattern. They count on it. But here's where things start to shifting over time if you truly maintain no contact, not as a punishment or a strategy, but as a boundary rooted in self-respect. They begin to feel the stillness. At first it's a relief, then it becomes a question, then a void. That's when their hope becomes something more anxious. Wait, why haven't they come back? Have they moved on? Do they not care anymore? The possibility that your silence might actually be permanent slowly begins to set in. And for someone who never fully processed the emotional safety you gave them, this can be deeply unsettling, because for all their distance, avoidants are still human. They still want connection, they're just afraid of it. So they often want to know they're loved without having to lean into that vulnerability. Your presence, even if inconsistent, once gave them that reassurance. When that reassurance disappears, it forces them to confront what they've lost. But only if the silence holds. They hope you'll return, because that allows them to avoid facing what it would mean if you didn't. It allows them to preserve their emotional comfort without doing the work. But real growth, for them, this isn't about you not. And for you, only begins when you stop showing up for a version of the relationship that only exists on their terms. No contact is often misunderstood. For some, it's used as a strategy to make the other person miss them, to shift the power dynamic, or to force a reaction. But the real power of no contact isn't in what it does to the other person, it's in what it does for you. When used from a place of emotional clarity, not manipulation, no contact becomes a declaration, I will no longer participate in something that depletes me. It's not about changing someone else's behavior. It's about recognizing what you need in order to heal and reclaim your self-worth. When you're dealing with someone who is emotionally avoidant, the instinct is often to work harder to keep the connection alive. You try to get closer, you try to explain, you try to prove your value. You begin over functioning in the relationship, hoping they'll finally meet you halfway. But with avoidance, the more you reach, the more they pull away. And so begins a painful loop. You're constantly trying to hold something together that the other person isn't fully committing to. It's exhausting. It erodes your confidence. It turns love into a chase. This is where no contact comes in. Not as a trick, but as a boundary. It's not about trying to punish them or get them to wake up. It's about saying, I deserve more than this imbalance. No contact allows you to step away from the emotional chaos and reconnect with the part of you that stopped asking, how do I fix this? And started asking, why am I accepting this? That shift is where your power lies. It's important to understand that no contact may not change the avoidant. In many cases, it doesn't. It might not suddenly make them available, reflective, or emotionally ready, but that's not the goal. The goal is for you to stop sacrificing your needs on the altar of their comfort. It's about stepping out of a dynamic where you're always hoping they'll finally choose you in the way you've been choosing them. Because if they weren't able or willing to meet you in the relationship, your absence likely won't teach them something your presence couldn't. What it can do, however, is give you the space to detox from the emotional confusion. It gives you the clarity to see what you've been tolerating, to notice how much you were giving, how little you were receiving, and how long you are hoping for crumbs to turn into commitment. That kind of clarity isn't found when you're still in the loop, waiting for a message or scanning their actions for meaning. It's found in distance, in silence, in the quiet knowing that you're no longer available for something that hurts you more than it heals you. So when you choose no contact, do it from a place of self-respect, not to provoke them, not to test them, but to protect your peace, reset your perspective. This isn't about you not, and realign with the version of you who knows their worth doesn't depend on someone else's ability to recognize it. People with an avoidant attachment style experience a deep inner conflict when it comes to emotional closeness. On the surface, they may appear independent, emotionally distant, or even uninterested in deep connection. But beneath that exterior, there's often a longing for love and intimacy, just not the kind that overwhelms them or threatens their sense of autonomy. This contradiction creates a complicated dynamic in relationships, especially when partners misread their detachment as lack of interest rather than fear. Avoidants do want connection. They want to be loved, desired, and understood. but they fear that closeness will come at the cost of losing themselves. To them, emotional intimacy often feels like pressure. They may have grown up in environments where love came with conditions, expectations, or emotional instability. As a result, they learn to cope by becoming self-reliant, often equating vulnerability with danger. So, when they start to feel emotionally close to someone, their instincts kick in, not to lean in, but to pull away. This push-pull behavior is confusing to their partners. One moment, the avoidant is affectionate, engaged, and even romantic. The next, they become distant, aloof, or completely shut down. It's not because their feelings disappeared, it's because those feelings got too close. That emotional intensity makes them feel like they're losing control, and to an avoidant, control is safety. They manage their discomfort by withdrawing emotionally or physically and creating distance. What makes this especially difficult in relationships is that avoidants often don't communicate what they're feeling. Instead of saying, "I'm feeling overwhelmed," or "I need space to self-regulate," they go quiet, become irritable, or disengage altogether. This leaves their partner guessing, often blaming themselves or trying harder to close the emotional gap. Ironically, this only increases the avoidants' need to distance themselves further, creating a painful cycle that neither person understands how to break. The challenge is that avoidants want to feel safe enough to love without losing their independence. But they haven't learned how to communicate that need in a healthy way. They want closeness, but they don't want it to come with emotional demands. They want affection, but not if it means being emotionally vulnerable. So they end up sending mixed signals, wanting you near but not too near. This is why boundaries are so important when dealing with an avoidant partner. Not to punish them, but to protect yourself from shrinking in an attempt to accommodate their fear of intimacy. You can't keep getting smaller just to make someone else feel safer, and they won't suddenly feel less afraid because you overextend yourself. If the avoidant is willing to grow and reflect, they can learn to tolerate and even embrace intimacy. But they have to do that work themselves. You can't force them to face the very thing they've spent years avoiding. What you can do is recognize the pattern, stop personalizing their behavior, and decide how much emotional ambiguity you're willing to accept in a relationship. Because while avoidants fear the cost of closeness, you also have to consider the cost of staying connected to someone who won't let you all the way in. There comes a moment in every relationship, especially with someone emotionally unavailable or avoidant, where you have to ask yourself, am I waiting to be chosen, or am I choosing myself? That shift in mindset is everything, because waiting to be chosen keeps you stuck. It places your worth in someone else's hands. It makes your self-esteem dependent on whether they finally realize what they have in you, whether they wake up and give you the love you've been hoping for. It keeps you trapped in a pattern where you're constantly auditioning for someone else's affection, hoping that if you're patient enough, quiet enough, or good enough, they'll eventually decide you're worth the effort. But choosing yourself is different. Choosing yourself is a reclaiming. It's when you decide to stop proving and start protecting. When you stop showing up for someone who only notices your absence when it threatens their comfort, not because they genuinely want to meet you in love. When you truly choose yourself, you stop settling for conditional love that comes on someone else's terms and timeline. You stop participating in the illusion that if you just wait a little longer, tolerate a little more, or change a little further, they'll finally become the person you need. Avoidants are often drawn to people who give more than they receive. People who overfunction, overunderstand, and overextend themselves emotionally. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just what feels familiar. But the reality is, if you stay in that role too long, you lose sight of your own needs. You forget what reciprocity feels like. You start to believe that love always feels like longing, waiting, uncertainty. You confuse being emotionally available with being endlessly patient, even when nothing is being offered in return. When you choose yourself, you stop waiting by the door. You stop hoping for breadcrumb affection. You stop spinning stories to justify why they can't show up. And it's not because you don't love them anymore. It's because you finally love you more. More than the version of love that's one-sided. More than the confusion. More than the silence. You decide that you're no longer going to be someone's emotional backup plan. You're no longer going to be a placeholder for someone who hasn't done the work to be present in a relationship. Choosing yourself doesn't always feel strong at first. Sometimes it feels like grief, like letting go of potential, like walking away from the hope that they might change. But over time, that grief clears, and what's left is clarity. You remember what it feels like to be centered, to not question your worth, to not beg for connection. You stop chasing people who need distance to feel safe and start attracting people who feel safe being close. Real love doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't keep you waiting in emotional limbo. And when you truly choose yourself, you stop mistaking someone else's emotional limitations for your lack of value. You realize that what you were hoping to get from them, you can now give to yourself, and eventually someone else will too. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for choosing growth over comfort. If this spoke to something in you, if it made you feel seen, validated, or just a little stronger, hold on to that. Healing isn't about being perfect. It's about recognizing patterns, setting boundaries, and choosing peace, even when it's hard. Wherever you are in your journey, whether you're just stepping away from a confusing connection or finding your strength after a long road back to yourself, I see you, and I'm proud of you. Take care of your heart, protect your energy, and most of all, remember you are not too much, too emotional, or too intense. You are just asking for the kind of love that's real. Thank you again, and until next time, take care of you.